So in this final video we'll have a look at conclusions and how you can develop your conclusion to deal with a part of the syllabus that talks about strengths and weaknesses of your argument and evidence. So if you look at the higher levels, you will see that it specifically says in AO3 and AO4, I think, that it's asked you to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the evidence that you discuss them. Now you can discuss this in the main body, but you can also just highlight this very explicitly in the concluding paragraph. So we'll give you a little bit of help with that. So this video focuses on if you are using 2 or 3 case studies. I wouldn't suggest you use any more than 3 case studies for pretty much any question in papers 1 and 2. Paper 3, however, is different, and there'll be a separate video that deals with paper 3. So there will be differences and similarities in your case studies. So we're just going to have a think about how those differences and similarities could manifest themselves. So when comparing your case studies, it's important to think the ways in which the 2 or 3 case studies that you have looked at are similar or different. So there are several factors here. So you can consider scale, location, level of economic development, culture, time. Is it in the past? Is it in the future? Or are you predicting the future, or is it in the present? Are your case studies long-term or short-term? And also for certain questions, governance, the type of governance and the quality of governance here, SDG 16 and 17, might be significant. So you can start to think about ways in which your case studies might be similar or different. So you're looking at making a comparison. Now if you have a look at these, they may be of similar scale and levels of economic development, but in, for example, a different culture or a different period of time. So at one level, you might want to think about your 2 case studies. What if your 2 case studies are very, very similar and you get similar outcomes? Well, this could be seen as a strength of your argument. You could be more confident that the same conclusions you've come to could be applied to other similar locations. So we get there the idea of transferability. So again, developing further, those 2 case studies of places that are similar and give similar outcomes, it's also a weakness. You've only looked at similar places, so any conclusions you draw might not be applicable to other scenarios. So again, we're talking about transferability. If you've looked at 2 very similar case studies, that's not a problem in itself, but you do need to recognise if you look at different case studies, you're very likely to come up with different outcomes. So any conclusion that you draw may not be transferable. 2 case studies of similar places that give different outcomes. This is a strength. The conclusions drawn recognise diversity in the world, and you could also emphasise cause and effect. So there we can see that we've got 2 case studies, different outcomes. Clearly there is some complexity that is going on here, and maybe some factors that you are not aware of that would have given rise to these different outcomes. So there you're showing diversity, and you're saying that cause and effect, you can say cause and effect is really complex, but you've not been able to identify them. 2 case studies of similar places that give different outcomes. This is also a weakness. Your conclusions are not generalizable. So you can see that the weakness can be a strength and the strength can be a weakness. The really important thing here is you explicitly recognise that with any argument there's always going to be strengths and weaknesses, no matter how you construct the argument and no matter what case studies you use. So let's think about 2 case studies of very different places that give different outcomes. Again, this is a strength. Of course, you would expect case studies that are different to have different cause and effect relationships. This could allow you to identify key factors. So there might be key factors that are different between those case studies. Those different factors are probably going to be significant in determining that cause and effect relationship. So it helps you to identify possible key and important factors that go to make your case study and your conclusions. Two case studies are very different places that get different outcome. It's also a weakness. With just two case studies, how can you be sure that you've identified the critical factors? So there will be factors that you are unaware of. This is a short essay and you're only an IB student. So there might be factors that are important in that cause and effect relationship which you've been unable to cover. So here you just need to say that is a weakness. You need to recognise the weaknesses and limitations of your argument. Two case studies are very different places that give similar outcomes. This is a strength. Perhaps you have identified an underlying law or pattern. Perhaps you've identified conclusions that are generalisable and could be applied to different locations. Two case studies, regardless of whether they are similar or different, that's going to be a weakness. You've only looked at two case studies and the world is very diverse. Within the limitations of your essay and your research, you really would have only been able to deal with two case studies. This is not a problem, but it's especially not a problem if you recognise that as a weakness of your argument. Again, with two case studies, regardless of if they're similar or different, whatever conclusions you've drawn, your conclusions will be coloured by your worldview and cultural biases. We all have our own worldview and we all have our own cultural biases. In many respects, it's unavoidable. In fact, those cultural biases and our own worldview is important because it defines us as an individual. However, it's important that we recognise that each of us does have a worldview and each of us does have cultural biases. So any conclusions that you draw will inherently be weak because you look at the world in a specific way through those cultural biases and your own worldview. So what we've tried to do here is we try to recognise very explicitly our strengths and weaknesses of our argument. Now I hope in this presentation that I've given you at least one weakness and one strength that you can talk about for pretty much any argument that you present. Now the good thing about this is it does potentially give you access to the higher grade levels, and you'll notice what we've done here is we've not actually added any more case study detail, we've not added any more evidence, but what we have done is we've placed a critical lens of being honest with ourselves about the strengths and weaknesses of our argument. So many students will say that's kind of like a bonus for free. You're not showing any extra knowledge, you're not putting any extra detail in there, you're just recognising the strengths and limitations of your argument. This is a really important part of your critical thinking process, and if you're doing this, you're showing the examiner that you have access to higher levels, particularly in AO3, which is critical thinking. Okay guys, so I hope you've found this video useful, and perhaps you'd like to have a look at the sorts of conclusions that in the past you have made on your essays.